The world is full of stories, some bring joy, some bring sorrow, and some linger in the shadows of our minds, leaving us with a chill that no fireplace can warm. This is a collection of such stories, tales of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Circumstances that defy logic. Circumstances that expose the darkness that hides just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. These stories are not for the faint of heart. They are for those who dare to peer into the abyss, knowing that the abyss may peer back. They are a testament to the enduring power of fear, a reminder that even in the safety of our homes, we are not always alone. Prepare yourself. For within these pages, you will encounter moving statues, hidden rooms, and watchful eyes. You will meet people grappling with the unknown, their sanity stretched to the breaking point. Their stories will stay with you long after you turn the final page. These stories are not just about the things that go bump in the night. They are about the darkness that resides within us all, the fear of the unknown, the suspicion that something is watching us from the shadows, the unsettling feeling that we are not in control. The protagonists of these stories are ordinary people. They are us, and their experiences remind us that the line between reality and nightmare is thin indeed. That sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the ones we imagine, but the ones that are all too real. The stories you are about to read are based on true events, or so the storytellers claim. Whether you believe them or not is up to you. But be warned, once you start reading, you may find it impossible to stop. The darkness has a way of drawing us in. Are you ready to face the darkness? The old house stood nestled among towering oaks and fragrant magnolias. It whispered stories of forgotten laughter and the gentle passage of time. For the young couple, it was a sanctuary, a refuge from the clamor of the city. The wife, with her bright eyes and infectious laugh, had fallen in love with the overgrown garden. "It just needs a little love," she'd said, her fingers trailing over the moss-covered shoulder of an angel statue. Her husband, a man of quiet practicality, had simply smiled and nodded. He saw the charm in her enthusiasm. The statues, however, did little to stir his imagination. They were relics of a bygone era, silent sentinels guarding secrets he had no desire to uncover. Their days fell into a comfortable rhythm. She, lost in her gardening gloves and sun hats. He, working from his home office, the sounds of her humming a counterpoint to the click of his keyboard. The garden, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, became their shared sanctuary, a place where anxieties faded and the weight of the world seemed a little lighter. But beneath the tranquility, a disquiet began to stir, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the moment before a storm breaks. It started with a feeling, a prickle of unease that danced at the edge of his vision. Then, one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, he saw it. One of the statues, the angel, had turned. He blinked, trying to clear the image from his vision. The fading light played tricks on the eyes. That had to be it. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The angel, which he was sure had been facing the house, now looked outward, its sightless eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. He tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination, but the unease lingered. It coiled in the pit of his stomach, a knot of dread that refused to be untied. The next day he found himself drawn back to the garden. The sun was high, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. He stopped before the angel, his heart pounding in his chest. It was facing the same way as the night before, its cold stone gaze fixed on the far end of the garden. He reached out, his fingers tracing the rough texture of the weathered stone. It was heavy, solid, immovable, or so he thought. The following morning he found another statue, a cherub holding a broken lyre, had shifted. It now faced the back fence, its back to the house. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe animals, raccoons or possums were bumping into them during their nightly escapades. But deep down, he knew it wasn't possible. The statues were too heavy, too firmly rooted in the earth. They hadn't moved in decades, perhaps centuries. Why were they moving now? And why did they always seem to turn away from the house, as if in silent reproach? He tried to share his concerns with his wife, but she just laughed. "You're letting your imagination run wild," she'd said, giving him a playful nudge. "They're just statues. They can't hurt us." But her words did little to ease his growing anxiety. He started noticing other things, strange sounds in the night, the rustling of leaves when there was no wind, the feeling of being watched from the shadows. He lost sleep, his dreams plagued by images of the statues coming to life, their stone eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Then came the morning when he stepped outside to find all of the statues lined up in a row at the edge of the yard. Their backs were to the house, their sightless eyes fixed on the woods beyond. It was as if they were standing guard, protecting the house from something unseen, or perhaps preventing him from leaving. He called the police, his voice trembling with a fear he couldn't disguise. They arrived, skeptical but polite. They examined the statues, their faces etched with puzzlement. They were heavy, far too heavy for anyone to have moved them without specialized equipment, and there were no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the soft earth. The police left, their departure doing little to ease the knot of fear that had taken root in his chest. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the very walls of his home had turned against him. That night, he awoke to a sound, a soft scratching at the back door. He lay frozen in bed, his heart pounding against his ribs. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. He forced himself to move, his bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. He peered through the blinds, his breath catching in his throat. There, bathed in the pale moonlight, were 5 figures. They wore white masks, blank and expressionless. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. He watched in horrified fascination as they moved closer to the house, their forms shifting in and out of the shadows. He wanted to scream, to run, but his voice was trapped in his throat. He stumbled back from the window, his mind reeling. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that these were not trick-or-treaters playing a prank. These were something else entirely, something ancient and evil, and they were here for him. The New Mexico sun beat down on the sprawling adobe house. It shimmered, a mirage in the desert heat. Inside, the couple unpacked boxes, their laughter echoing in the cavernous rooms. Excitement hung in the air, tinged with the faintest tremor of apprehension. The house was old, its history whispered in the creaking floorboards and the scent of dust that clung to the air. "This place is incredible," the wife said, her voice filled with awe. An artist, she saw potential in every shadowed corner, every chipped paint. Her husband, a man of logic and order, nodded in agreement, a sense of unease settling in his gut. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with the lights, flickering bulbs in the upstairs hallway, an unresponsive switch in the master bedroom. "Probably just faulty wiring," he muttered, his toolkit already open on the kitchen floor. Old houses came with old problems, it was to be expected. He descended the creaky wooden stairs to the basement. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else he couldn't quite place. Musty, like forgotten secrets. His flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a warren of cobwebs and discarded furniture, and then he saw it. A door. Large, metal, industrial-looking. It was set into the far wall, almost invisible beneath a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. His pulse quickened. He hadn't noticed it before. It had been hidden, obscured by the clutter of the previous owner's belongings. Curiosity warred with caution. He ran his hand over the cold metal, his fingers tracing the outline of a heavy padlock. It was securely locked, no give at all. What was it hiding? A storm shelter? A root cellar? The previous owner had mentioned something about a tornado shelter, but her voice had been hesitant, her eyes darting away from his. He returned upstairs, his mind abuzz with questions. There's a locked door in the basement. he told his wife, watching her reaction closely. She paused, her paintbrush hovering in midair. "Oh," she said, her voice unnaturally high. It's probably just junk. The old owners never used the basement." He wasn't convinced. The look on her face, fleeting but unmistakable, told him there was more to the story. But he let it go, for now. He was an electrician, not a detective. And yet, the mystery of the locked door nagged at him, a persistent itch beneath his skin. Days turned into weeks, the locked door a silent sentinel in his thoughts. Finally, he could take it no longer. He called a locksmith, ignoring his wife's protests. "It's just an old door," she'd pleaded, her eyes wide with a fear he couldn't comprehend. "Let it be." But he couldn't. The need to know, to understand, was a burning ember in his chest. The locksmith, a wiry man with calloused hands and a knowing smile, worked quickly. The padlock fell to the floor with a heavy thud, the sound echoing in the silence of the basement. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of incense and something else, something metallic and cloying. The room was small, almost a cell. A single bare bulb cast a dim light on the walls, revealing strange symbols drawn in charcoal. Old photographs hung haphazardly, their subjects staring out at him with hollow eyes. A cot lay in the corner, a threadbare blanket tossed aside. This wasn't a storage room, someone had been living here. He stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. A wave of dizziness washed over him, the smell in the room making his stomach churn. As he turned to leave, he noticed another door, this one concealed behind a tattered tapestry. He pulled it open, his hand trembling. It led to a narrow passage, the air cold and damp. He followed it, his flashlight beam dancing over rough-hewn stone. The passage ended at another door, this one made of heavy wood. He pushed it open, a gust of cool night air hitting him in the face. It was a cellar door leading outside, hidden from view by the sprawling branches of a cottonwood tree. He stood there for a moment, his mind racing. This changed everything. That night he lay awake in bed, his wife's steady breathing doing little to ease the fear that tightened his throat. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind in the trees sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that they were not alone. Then he heard it, a soft scratching at the cellar door. He sat up in bed, his blood turning to ice. Someone was out there, and they were trying to get in. The silence was the first thing he noticed. It pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't used to silence. He'd grown up in a house filled with the sounds of family, the comforting cacophony of shared meals and boisterous laughter. Now, in his first home, a small bungalow on a quiet street, the silence was deafening. He found himself drawn to the tiny balcony off his bedroom. There, amidst the scent of jasmine and the faint hum of distant traffic, he could almost forget about the oppressive silence that clung to the empty rooms inside. He'd light a cigarette, the glowing embers a small comfort in the gathering darkness, and let his thoughts drift. Across the street, nestled behind a tangle of overgrown ivy and neglected rose bushes, stood another house. It was a mirror image of his own, yet it exuded an air of abandonment, of forgotten memories and long-kept secrets. The windows were dark, the paint peeling, the lawn a wild expanse of knee-high grass. He'd seen an elderly woman there a few times, her frail form moving like a shadow through the overgrown yard. She never waved, never smiled, never acknowledged his presence in any way. Her face, etched with a lifetime of untold stories, remained an impassive mask. He found himself wondering about her, this silent sentinel in the house across the street. As the days turned into weeks, he became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. It started with a feeling, a prickling at the back of his neck, a sense of being observed. At first he dismissed it as his imagination, the byproduct of too much solitude and the unfamiliar weight of silence that hung heavy in the air. But then, one evening, as he stood on his balcony, cigarette smoke curling into the twilight, he saw her, the old woman, She was standing at her living room window, her face partially hidden by the faded lace curtains. He couldn't make out her expression, but he could feel her gaze, cold and unwavering, fixed on him. He shifted uncomfortably, stubbing out his cigarette in the overflowing ashtray. He told himself it was a coincidence that she was simply looking out her window, lost in her own thoughts. But the feeling of unease lingered, a knot of dread tightening in his chest. From then on, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he stepped onto his balcony, he would find himself glancing across the street, half expecting to see her face framed in the window, her eyes boring into him. He tried to ignore it, to focus on other things, but the feeling persisted, a constant undercurrent of unease that seeped into his waking hours. One cool evening, as he strolled home from the corner store, a flash of white caught his eye. It was lying in the middle of his neatly raked lawn, a stark contrast to the browning grass. He bent down, his brow furrowed in confusion. It was a sock, a child's sock, white with a faded pink stripe. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was small, delicate, clearly belonging to a girl, but he didn't recognize it. He had no children, and none of his neighbors had children that young. He checked his porch, his driveway, even peering under his car, but there was no sign of its owner. He shrugged it off as a strange occurrence, a misplaced item that would surely be reunited with its owner soon enough. But as he unlocked his front door, a shiver ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that the sock was out of place, that its presence on his lawn was not accidental. The following day, he found another sock. This one was blue, lying in the same spot as the previous one. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This was no coincidence. Someone was leaving these socks on his lawn. But why? His answer came a few nights later. He was jarred awake by the insistent ringing of his doorbell. It was late, well past midnight. Who could be calling at this hour? He stumbled out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He peered through the peephole, his blood turning to ice. It was the old woman. Her face, normally expressionless, was contorted in a rictus of rage, her eyes wild and unfocused. She was clutching a kitchen knife, the blade glinting ominously in the porch light. Before he could react, she slammed her frail body against the door, the force of the impact rattling the frame. "My son! You have my son!" she screamed, her voice a high-pitched wail that sent chills down his spine. "Give him back!" Terror lent him a surge of adrenaline. He threw his weight against the door, forcing it shut against her frantic assault. She continued to pound on the door, her screams echoing in the night. He scrambled for his phone, his fingers fumbling as he dialed 911. As the operator answered, he could hear the sirens in the distance, approaching, growing louder. The old woman's screams subsided into sobs, her frail body slumping against the door. When the police arrived, they found her sitting on his porch, rocking back and forth, clutching the kitchen knife, her eyes vacant and lost. He learned later that she suffered from dementia, that she had believed he was holding her son captive. But even as the police led her away, her eyes met his, and in that brief moment, he saw a flicker of something cold and calculating, something that belied the frail, confused old woman she appeared to be. The protagonists of these tales retreated from their unsettling encounters, seeking solace in the familiar. The couple with the moving statues installed security cameras, their once peaceful garden now a grid of watchful eyes. Silence fell upon the statues, their silent dance abruptly ended. Yet, the question lingered, what had set them in motion? The couple in New Mexico boarded up the hidden door, the weight of its secrets too heavy to bear. They tried to forget the shrine-like room, the unsettling photographs, the chilling realization that someone had been living beneath their feet. But the desert night held its breath, a silent reminder of the unseen passage that lay buried beneath their home. And the man who had sought solace in the quiet of his first home? He moved. The image of the old woman's face, contorted in a mask of madness, haunted his dreams. The silence he had once craved now echoed with her chilling screams. He left behind the child's socks, small and forgotten, a testament to the darkness that can lurk even in the most ordinary of places. These stories offer no easy answers. They are glimpses into the shadows, where logic falters and reason cowers. They leave us with a profound sense of unease, a disquieting awareness of the fragility of our reality. Were the statues imbued with a life of their own, their movements a silent warning? Did the locked room harbor ancient secrets, its darkness a magnet for the lost and the disturbed? Was the old woman's madness a reflection of her own shattered past, or something more sinister, something that preyed on the vulnerable? We are left to grapple with these questions, to confront the unsettling possibility that some things defy explanation, that the world is a far stranger, far more unsettling place than we care to imagine. These stories are not merely tales of the supernatural. They are reflections of our deepest fears, our primal anxieties about the unknown. They tap into our collective unconscious, reminding us that even in an age of reason and technology, there are forces at play beyond our comprehension. The moving statues, the locked safe room, the creepy neighbor, these are not just plot devices, they are metaphors for the uncertainties that plague us all. The fear of the unknown, the suspicion that we are not alone, the chilling realization that things are not always what they seem. These stories remind us that the line between sanity and madness is thin indeed, that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the ones that lurk in the shadows, but the ones that reside within us. We are drawn to these stories because they offer us a glimpse into the abyss, a safe space to confront our deepest fears. They allow us to experience the thrill of terror without the burden of consequence, and in doing so, they remind us that we are not alone in our fears. The darkness is real. It exists in the shadows of our homes, in the depths of our minds, in the spaces between what we know and what we can never truly understand. But so too is the light. And it is in the face of darkness that the light shines brightest. So, the next time you find yourself alone in the quiet of your home, remember these stories, remember the moving statues, the locked safe room, the creepy neighbor, and remember this: the darkness may linger, but it will never truly conquer the light.